Hi, this is Scott from the Waterwise Community Center, and today we're here to talk about and demonstrate pruning Allen Chickering Sage, Pozo Blue Sage, Whirly Blue Sage, or any of the other variety of closely related Cleveland sage hybrids. These are popular plants for California native gardens because in the spring to summer, and sometimes a little bit again in the fall, they have beautiful, beautiful clusters of purple flowers, which are adored by hummingbirds, pollinators. The old flower clusters turn into dried seeds, which are eaten by finches and other small birds, and the plant itself smells amazing. With all these good qualities, why wouldn't we plant it in every single garden? Well, one of the things about this plant is that it gets quite big. And unpruned especially, it'll get even bigger than any of the nursery labels say it's going to be. You often might read that this plant is going to be 6 or 7 feet wide. In our Southern California inland conditions, unpruned, we have specimens of Allen Chickering Sage that are out in our park that are 10, 12, going up to 15 feet wide. And so a lot of people just don't have that much space. But with annual pruning, you can prune it back to 6, maybe even 5 feet every single fall or early winter, stimulate some nice, beautiful growth over that cool season into spring, and be rewarded with lots of beautiful flowers in the spring going on to potentially early summer. But what we find specifically with the Allen Chickering Sage, Pozo Blue Sage, Whirly Blue Sage, and those are all essentially the same cross between a natural Cleveland sage and a natural purple sage, which combines the best qualities of both for use in a cultivated garden. Essentially, you can mix and match those plants, and most people won't be able to tell the difference at all. I use them interchangeably. But with all of those, what we find is it's better to prune them every year. Definitely no more than every other year, but ideally every year, or just let them go. And that sometimes when you've let them go for a number of years and then try to do a hard cut back, the plant doesn't respond that well aesthetically. It'll live, but it'll kind of grow luxuriously in some places, and then it'll just have dead stems in other places. And so what I really like to do everywhere I have this in a garden situation is to cut it back every single year if at all possible and give it a pretty good cut back. We're not going to be cutting it all the way to the ground, but essentially we're going to be trying to remove all of the dried flower stems. So that's, if we just remove the dried flower stems, that'd be called deadheading. But what we're going to do is deadheading plus, to where we'll be removing that, as well as trying to remove probably about a third to a half of the branch length if possible, making sure that we leave plenty of nice leafy growth underneath to be stimulated and grow back out. With these sages, we don't want to leave just dry stems. Some of those will break bud and leaf out, but again, with this selection of plants, in my experience, it's not always as consistent as some of the other plants, which will very reliably do that. And so with that, we are going to get going and we are going to start cutting. And so what I first am going to do is I'm going to remove anything that just obviously needs to go. So with any of these branches that are really dry all the way down to the bottom, I'm just going to start removing them. And if you don't know if it's dried all the way back or alive, what you can always do is you could use the blade of your pruners, which you're keeping nice and sharp, and you can kind of scrape, and it's called scraping to look at the cambium. The cambium is the layer that's just underneath the bark, and if it's alive, it's going to be green as soon as you get underneath the bark, and if it's alive and you do that before you cut it, and you just do it in one small place, that's not going to negatively harm the plant. But if it's dry, and eventually you can learn to kind of feel by the texture as it goes, but if it's dry, you know that's dead all the way back, and you can just remove it. And with some of these plants like the sage, especially the flowering stalks, having some amount of life, or at the end of the season having it be kind of dead all the way to the back. Neither one of those are important indicators for overall plant health and how well the plant is doing. That's just part of the natural growth and kind of dieback cycle of the plant, but to stimulate that plant to keep it looking good and alive as long as possible in a garden setting, we want to remove most of that dead growth, if not all of it, every single year. And I'm not going to be checking every inch because there's a lot of stems I need to get going, but I'm just kind of estimating and making sure that I remove enough back into live material that we're going to be stimulating some good growth. And so anything that's clearly dead, we're checking out. Sometimes you can kind of feel something and you kind of pull it out. And for example, it doesn't need to be perfect. So I was guessing this was mostly dead, and there's some live on it, but I'm not going to beat myself up about it. I'm just going to keep going. Because if you labor over every single cut, you'll be here all day. And as much as it's nice to spend time in this lovely smelling bush, I want to be here for an appropriate amount of time, not all day. Here we do have some life on this. We'll see here. Maybe I'll leave this for now. I'll probably end up cutting it back a little bit more later. And clearing out some of that longer, mostly dead stuff is also just going to give me more access to do more detailed pruning in the center of it. So what do we do when we have something like this? There's some nice growth up here, but it's kind of long and woody. I'm still going to cut this back because either I want to stimulate some buds based on this cut farther down, and I can even see, actually, if I look down in here, that there are a few buds starting to grow. So I know there's some nice life along this. There's also life in here because we can see it up at the top. And so if we just keep letting this grow, it's not going to leaf out as much along the branch, and it's going to kind of be just top heavy with growth and awkward looking. It's not going to have that nice compact form that we're looking for over time. And so I'm not going to go to any particular spot. There's enough density of bud locations along this that it doesn't really matter exactly where I cut it. I'm just going to kind of cut it back maybe halfway, maybe 2/3 of the way, a little bit lower below this other leafy stuff. And I'm going to set this aside, and we're just going to be increasing some density. I am going to come now and do the same thing here. Here, this is a perfect example of where we want to cut back to. We want to remove all of this, but we have this beautiful, beautiful kind of lower growth. So I'm just going to cut right above that. And that'll stimulate that growth that's already starting lower down to really start to do its thing. So that's often the case. So you can see here, I have some good growth lower down. You might not exactly be able to see the angle, but there's some good growth kind of right down in there, and I'm cutting right above that. Even though I'm removing a good amount of material, that's fine. That's sort of what I need to do to control the size a little bit and to stimulate that growth lower down. Here's another example for now. I'll cut this at least down to here. Here, again, there's some growth, but I'm going to remove this, cut it back significantly. Sometimes I call this deadheading plus. If we just deadhead, we're only going to cut down to here, but there's all of this. So plus, back to where it's really going to become bushier. And I'm going to keep going at a pretty good pace, make sure I make progress. One thing I try to include as often as possible is when you're doing hand pruning with a nice sharp pruners, and it's important to keep them sharp because it makes the work more accurate. It's easier on the hand. It's actually safer, so you're not trying to crank on it. Most important thing to always remember, has nothing to do with the plant. Make sure you know where your other hand is. You never want to cut your fingers. And especially as you get used to this and you start doing it a little faster, which is a good thing, always give your other hand plenty of space as it's doing the work. For me, it's always kind of up in the mix on the farther part of the stem so I can carefully but efficiently remove. At the edges, this is a pretty common situation that you'll run into as it gets to late fall, early winter pruning season for these plants, where there's maybe some nice growth here in the more center part. There's some nice growth on the outer edge, but there's all of this kind of dry stuff in the middle. And remember, one of our main motivations for pruning is not only to have the plant really remain very vigorous, but we also want to make sure that in a garden situation, we're not letting this beautiful sage that can get rather large get too big for the space we have put it in. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to, with as natural a look as possible, just remove everything up to here. And so this is related to a technique that you might have heard about called undercutting. And basically, although this isn't a classic undercut situation, the idea is that we're going to leave relatively unaltered or just lightly trimmed lush foliage more on the top. And then when we're cutting these to maintain our natural look as much as possible after pruning, we're not going to just cut in a straight line and leave a bunch of stems. But when we cut, we're actually going to reach in and we're going to cut these farther in underneath largely our existing, and that we're going to leave lusher looking foliage that's farther back towards the center of the plant. And the ideal kind of undercut situation, and depending on what's going on with the plant and just kind of the options that you have, you might not always be able to accomplish this. But in the ideal undercut situation, and what you're going for is essentially that you're going to be removing this material, but when you're done, it looks almost completely natural because most of the cuts are kind of hidden underneath the canopy. And so to the casual observer, it just looks like the plant is naturally smaller. It doesn't actually take that much time compared to other styles of pruning. And what you get is a much nicer look kind of day one after pruning than you would have otherwise had. And that doesn't work with some other plants that need a really hard cut back to really reinvigorate across the whole plant. But with plants that like kind of a medium reinvigorating cut back, like this Allen Chickering Sage, and especially ones that have lots and lots and lots of branches, the undercut is quite effective. This works well with a lot of the buckwheat species. This works well with pigeon point coyote brush, some of the other ground covers. Sometimes here you can see, I can tell that this is all pretty dry. I'm just kind of removing that material. And so if you're really looking for individual cuts, you can certainly see them. But if someone is just casually, we're going to remove this next, but if someone's just casually walking by in the garden, this has a much more natural look than if I was just kind of chopping straight down. And again, didn't take that much longer. And so for here, we're going to go back to our kind of thought of removing at least half, maybe 2/3. We can cut here. I'm going to cut farther into the bush. We have some nice foliage here. And a lot of these, if I see an area where it's already starting to bud out a couple of small leaves, I'll cut right above that. But if I don't see that, as long as I'm keeping up with these prunings, ideally every year, there's still going to be a lot of vigorous stem material that will branch back out. And I'm going to kind of work my way all the way around the circumference doing that. And then I'll get back into the middle and decide how much size control on the top to do from there. And there's no specific way to do it. It's not that edge is better first, middle is better first. The only real things that I really encourage you to make sure that you do every time you're pruning a shrub like this is, one, after you work for a while, every few minutes, take a step back. Make sure you're not unintentionally just in there working, taking off more material than you intend to. If it happens, that's fine. It'll probably grow back, but taking a step back every once in a while really helps. Number two, make sure that you actually get out there and do the pruning if indeed this is a plant that you intend to prune for that size control, for that vigor. What often happens, especially when people have their first water-wise or first California native garden, is you'll plant things and then first year, although we do recommend some establishment pruning, especially on sages, to get some kind of ideal form, and you can check our other resources for information about that on our Waterwise Garden Planner. But kind of often it's like at a year, things are starting to grow in beautifully. Maybe they don't need pruning yet. 2 years, they're starting to reach full size. But by the time you get to year 3, definitely year 4, if you are intimidated to do your pruning, oftentimes what happens is that things will be bigger than you wanted them to be or too woody. And you need to do additional work, which is now harder and more complicated than if you just took it on at the appropriate time. So you don't need to do it perfectly, especially if you're starting to do your trimming when plants are young and vigorous. They'll bounce back if you cut back a little too much, but make sure that you're not intimidated. Just jump in, do the thing, and learn from there. And so with that, we're going to keep going and keep working on this Allen Chickering Sage. So on this side, for whatever reason, we have a little bit of a different condition, but one you may well run into. So I wanted to show this separately, where we have actually quite a lot more kind of live and somewhat lush foliage all the way along the branch. And so we have more options to choose from in terms of how hard we want to cut this back. And so normally in a situation like this, we can not really worry as much about the entire branch length once it gets woody all the way in the plant. But when we look at the kind of leafy part of this section of branches, I am going to be choosing to remove at least half of the foliage, if not 2/3 of the foliage from each branch. So still leaving a good amount of kind of lusher growth, and that will respond very well to the pruning. But really on these plants where we're actually aiming for some size control, if we don't remove kind of at least 1/3, but usually on very vigorous plants like this, I find myself doing a half as kind of the standard. To on like real kind of floppy branches like this is a little bit on the shadier side of the plant, and especially for this species over in this corner, I'll remove 2/3 right up to here, no problem at all. Here, maybe I'll go closer to half. Not really laboring over each decision, but really knowing that I want to increase bushiness. I want to have it be less leggy. So I'm going to be removing a good amount of material. And then these kind of dried flowers. And we'll proceed from there. So at this point, Kaylee and I have worked doing our pruning around the perimeter of this sage, and you can see we've already obtained quite a lot of reduction in the width. This is down to about 5.5 or 6 feet wide now, so exactly in the kind of target for our annual cutback. But I did take a step back and just kind of looked around, and one thing that I did notice is that I'm not sure if you can see it on the camera here, but this section right here kind of looks a little lumpy compared to the rest of the shrub. And part of the reason for that is because as I was pruning, I was just kind of being guided by where there's more lush growth, and it's kind of woody on the inside here. That's just the way the plant grew. And so this is a decision-making point, and it's going to depend on your garden, the look you're going for. Some people would want to cut this back more, see if they could reinvigorate some growth and have a much more even shape. Probably if it was me at home, I'd just let it be kind of awkwardly shaped and it's going to grow out. But in this case, we have some valve boxes right here, and this is a public garden, and we want to kind of ideally maintain a little bit more of an even shape in this particular section of the garden. If it was out in our park, I'd be less concerned, and we want to make sure we maintain access to our valve boxes. So I'm actually going to cut a little bit deeper into some of the woodier material, but I'm going to be choosing areas where I can see a few small leaves already coming out that I know it's going to grow back from, even though I know it's going to leave this a little bit more bare for the next 4-6 weeks or so. Best for the kind of long-term growth and form of the plant. And so with that, I'll be going all the way as far back as cutting off this whole section. And so this might take a little bit more kind of bouncing back and forth. I'm still making sure I leave a few buds as often as possible, but in here I am prioritizing a little bit more the reduction in mass just for this one section. So it's not going to have that smooth undercut look for now, but the plant gives you different opportunities and constraints just based on how it grows, and we are going to respond based on our priorities. And that's kind of what pruning is like in most cases. I mean, there are some things not to do with pruning. Plants that don't want to get cut all the way to the ground should not get cut all the way to the ground. But other than that, part of it's being just kind of determined by what your priorities are, the look you're going for. And so you should feel empowered over time, and this might not make sense if you've never done pruning before, but over time you should feel empowered to just think about your priorities. Do you want a more wild look? Do you want a more cultivated look, even with the same plant? Do you really want an even form after you cut back? Are you just kind of following the growth of the plant? There's no one right way to do it. If you follow the general principles and descriptions that we have on the Waterwise Garden Planner, for any of these individual plants, you're going to be in the ballpark with what you do and how you approach it. And in the vast majority of cases, that means you'll be doing just fine. And so I think that got kind of the mass that I was hoping to even out. And so always, I'm going to take a quick step back. And for some of this real floppy growth, maybe I'll cut it back just a little bit, just to encourage it to be a little bit bushier. We'll take a step back, make sure things are looking good, and then we'll decide what to do next. So now we've changed the angle that we're shooting from a little bit because the sun is shifting, but essentially where we're at is we've worked our way pretty well all the way around the perimeter of this Allen Chickering Sage, and now we have this sort of situation on the top. And because we are only pruning this once a year, this is going to be our opportunity to remove this material and also reinvigorate growth up top. And I'm actually a little sad to do this because I love the dried seed heads in the garden. I think they're beautiful. Occasionally the birds, although they've gotten most of the seed out, will still come around and pick through it. But we're gonna make use of this material in the garden in just a moment. And so essentially what we're going to be doing is making the same decisions, the kind of same amount of cutback, deadheading plus, but we're going to be doing it on the more vertical growth on this shrub, and that's actually a little bit easier to do, so we're just going to jump into it and get going. On some of these kind of leafy parts, in addition to the deadheading, remember I'm taking off, in most cases about half, but could be a third, a half, up to 2/3 of the growth to reinvigorate that bushiness. It's very useful to be collecting stems and branches as you go in one hand. Speeds up the whole process quite a bit. Anything that's just quite dead, we're cutting pretty much all the way back here, kind of in between. We'll cut it back part way, and then I'll go back to it. Maybe I'll remove more, maybe I won't when I take my final look as I'm getting towards the end. I've gotten most of the seed heads out now, and so now I'm coming and doing some final last trims just to ensure that bushiness, kind of just taking little bits off the top. Again, being very careful with my hand position because I'm cutting just a few inches away from my hand. If you have not done this a whole lot, gloves that are thick enough to provide some protection, usually the cloth ones with rubberized hands, not the thick leather ones, are really good. It's a good balance between being able to feel what you're doing, but still providing a little bit extra protection. I do this all the time, and I've learned to become very careful and feel that I'm more nimble and work a little bit faster in most cases without gloves on, but have the technique to be very safe while I'm doing it. And so let's take a step back and see where we're at. I'm already seeing there's some unsightly dead material. Before I even take my step back. All right, now we'll take our step back and see how we're doing. And I think we're going to call this done for the day. You can see there's just 1 or 2 dried seed heads sticking out. I think I can see 3, and I like that as just leaving something a little bit more naturalistic still left over. The shrub has definitely been cut back, but it's very different and more natural style than if somebody just took a hedge trimmer to it, which would not have worked well at all for this species because it would have just left a real combination of leftover dead material, all cut at the exact same height as the living material. And this really clears more of the dead out and sets up this Allen Chickering Sage for renewed growth immediately in the next few weeks. So now let's take a look at how much of the mass of this plant was removed to obtain this annual reinvigorating cut on this Allen Chickering Sage. You can see here we removed not quite 50%, but definitely more than a third of the total kind of mass of this plant just by eyeballing it, and really was enough to remove all of the old flower stems, a lot of the dried material, and get it back to much more kind of young, vigorous growing material, which is going to set up very nicely for a beautiful spring bloom. Now, what do you do with all of this material in your garden? It depends on what your resources are. If your only ability of what to do with this is to put it in the green bin, that is okay. But what I always encourage people to do with at least a portion of the material from all of the sage trimmings coming out of a plant would be to do a little bit of either what's called chop and drop, which is taking individual stems and just cutting off bits and anywhere between 2 and 6 inches and adding them naturally into the mulch layer. Again, be careful with where your finger is if you're doing this quickly. And to obtain that for at least a little bit of it efficiently. And this is not going to be an efficient way to do the entire plant. But for example, you can see here, we had our initial planting layer of wood chip mulch. And over time, the best mulch in a native planting that both looks the most natural and is the healthiest for the plants in most situations is going to be the natural plant material. That's the kind of true natural mulch, as long as your plants don't have any disease issues or are healthy. And so always take just a moment to add just a little bit, different plants kind of here and there. Normally around my plantings, I like to say that with mulch, wood chip mulch that I'm bringing in, it's kind of one and done, just to get things until the plants are established, cover and cool the soil a little bit. And then I'm mostly ideally working with the natural material that the plant is either dropping itself or doing little bits of chopping and dropping as I go. And what I like to do at home is I have a modest plug-in electrical wood chipper. It doesn't take huge branches, but it takes branches up to about 1.5 inches. And it goes kind of slowly, but it's perfect for grinding up all of this material into beautiful natural mulch in the garden. So I'll accumulate a good amount of it with my pruning. I have a space that I dedicate to accumulating it just for a little while, not so much that it becomes a fire hazard. And then I'll listen to some audiobooks in my headphones on a Sunday while I'm grinding stuff up and making my own natural mulch layer. So that's one way to do it. And again, you're not going to get through this whole thing just by hand. But the other thing I also always really like to do, either with the pruners or just with my hands, is to take all of these flower stems and stalks and just to kind of break them up. Because although some bird species, especially with the sages, will come and they will be perfectly content to eat as many of the little seeds as they can grab while they are up on the plant, there's also some seeds locked up in these that other bird species, which like to forage off of the ground, will come around for in your garden if you leave those seeds present. So in yards in our area, once you chop and drop and leave the seeds in the ground, you will often get mourning doves, you will get towhees, and in the winter, you might even get white-crowned sparrows coming to your yard to feed on the seeds. They need good food, and they're a delight to see foraging in the garden. So here we are a few weeks later, as you can tell from the growth in my beard, and what we have is exactly what we were hoping for. We cleared out all of the old material that we wanted to just ahead of these really nice bursts of seasonal new growth. And if you look closely, we can see that we got a lot of nice bushy growth in response to these cuts that we made, which will give us this nice dense foliage ahead of the spring blooming season. And all of these cuts that multiply this bushy growth are going to give us even more blooms than we would have gotten had we chosen not to prune. And so if you found this video helpful, please remember to like this video to help other people find it, and be sure to subscribe to our channel to get all of our upcoming updates.